Good evening and welcome to the Mars Hill House of Intellectual Discourse. I'm Joshua Johnson and we're continuing our study of Rethinking Reality. We're going through dialogues of Hylas and Philonous by George Berkeley in order to better understand the thought of Jonathan Edwards. And tonight I'd like to go through some review on a few things that we covered in the last study, being primary qualities. And the primary qualities have to do with those things. Actually, it's a distinction that was originally done in Democritus, but then it was brought back to the forefront by John Locke. And primary qualities had to do with things that are said to be in the object, external to the mind, whereas secondary qualities are said to be in the mind. Now, this distinction is rejected by Berkeley completely, but the way Locke had articulated it was that primary qualities included things like motion, solidity, and extension, whereas secondary qualities had to do with taste, smell, touch, sight, all along those lines. And so the distinction was that the sensations that we would typically call secondary qualities, like with the taste and the smell and the sight and the color, all that stuff's in the mind. But extension, solidity, and motion, also mass, weight, etc., those are in the object. Now, we began 2 studies ago with primary qualities, starting with extension. And you see all the criticisms with extension with the same arguments that he actually used with secondary qualities. The identity argument, as well as the relativity argument, were just 2 examples. He used those extensively against extension. Now, when he went to motion and solidity in the last study, primarily these 2, he addressed, with motion, he discussed about like the relativity of time sensation, like how we feel time go by. And that because motion is a relationship between time and space, moving through time in relationship to space, vice versa, that was sort of what he was addressing. He was saying, okay, well, you can from a distance see an object moving, it doesn't seem to be moving as fast as when you're right up next to it. Things of that sort. Well, is motion in the object then? And then, of course, now he briefly covers these, and he also covers solidity, resistance. An example with solidity, when you have a table and you push up against it, it feels hard. For an animal with great strength, that table might feel quite soft because it can just rip right through it. And so the idea is that solidity is relative, but if solidity was in the object, it'd be the same for all beings. Now, these arguments are very quick. He doesn't really describe them too much, defend them too much. They're real quick summaries. And I think the reason he does this is because he says, well, we can subsume these all under extension. Now, without extension, we can't think of solidity or motion or any of these other primary qualities. The extension is assumed in all of them. And extension was one of the arguments that he had a very strong case to make. He had a very strong case against extension because it was so tightly related to the idea of visual sensation. Like, you can't conceive of extension apart from that visual perception. Mm-hmm. And therefore, using the same arguments he would use with something like visual sensation in relation to color, he did the same thing with extension. You have a relativity from distance, you get the changes based on distance, therefore how can it be in the object? Likewise, what about different minds, like a mite, a man? We'll look at the same object and it's completely different in size. Is size in the object, therefore? That's the argument. Mm-hmm. And so he goes through primary qualities, and I think he does quite well in dealing with them, mostly because he does relate them directly to extension, and he relates extension to secondary qualities. So moving on from that review, I want to go back a little bit further, to go back to secondary qualities. I just wanted to bring this reminder up. I had some people online who had asked me some questions about the relationship between sensible properties in an object and the idea of what Berkeley's saying, which is the idea that sense experiences are in the mind. But people have objected, saying, well, Berkeley isn't saying anything anybody really believes. No one believes that a sense experience is in the object. And one of the objections made out that I am experiencing a quality that is in the object. The sense experience is my mind, that is and I think Berkeley's going to be answering this in this very study. The idea behind this is that I'm discovering a quality. That's sort of the notion that was brought up online in the objection. Well, isn't this what we really believe? Isn't Berkeley talking about something that doesn't really exist, like a position? And I wanted to review the knowledge argument only because it summarizes all of his arguments against secondary qualities, and it helps to understand what he's getting at. Now, the knowledge argument is a philosophy of mind argument to distinguish consciousness from physical properties. But it's also used by Berkeley in a subtle way to show that sensations exist in consciousness. And it's probably because you can't really distinguish the two. Consciousness and sense experience or sense awareness. So, in the knowledge argument, you have Mary, who's in a room, black and white room, black and white monitors, trying to study the color red. And to understand, what she's trying to understand is, what is redness? What is redness? She looks at different gauges, different computer screens, technologies, models. She sees the wavelengths of light, where it's supposed to be at. She sees testimonies, people saying that they've seen redness, trying to describe it, which I imagine would be very difficult if someone tried to describe redness to someone who's blind. The whole gamut. She's looking at synapses firing in the brain. She's looking at all these different things, contractions and things going on in the retina. She's looking at all this stuff in this black and white room. And then she steps out of that room and sees redness for the first time. Has she learned something new? The reason it is unanimously said that yes, except those who attempt to deny the obvious, is because when she leaves that room, she is discovering redness for the first time. It's because redness in and of itself is not something that you can understand in terms of these other events, like light, objects. And now what's so amazing about this knowledge argument, not just for proving consciousness is not physical, but it actually shows that even the stuff that she was examining in her own room can be used under the same argument. Okay, so with redness, she can't understand redness from looking at light and brain waves and things like that. But what about her knowledge of the brain waves to begin with? Or the knowledge she had of the light? Okay, let's say it was all in black and white. Well, how does she know about blackness? What if she's ever only seen redness? Would she learn of blackness the same way, by seeing it? So even everything in her own room that she was trying to figure out redness with is itself reducible to the same argument. Sense experiences. It's not that objects are made of sensible qualities. That's not Berkeley's argument. He's saying that objects are made up of subjective experience. They're made up of redness, which is something that must be experienced by a person with their mind. So if an object is a collection of things like redness, then the whole of the object requires experience, a subjective experience, the mind, the consciousness being aware of it. It's not that there's a mind-independent object with these qualities that we discover. How we know about the object at all is only by these experiences. Just like pain. Pain is not in the object. I don't discover pain. I have a pain in my mind. Similarly, redness and all these other qualities are out there. This is something I wanted to clarify for people who don't really understand what Berkeley's getting at. He is dealing with sensible qualities, argument that objects have sensible qualities, but he's trying to show that the distinction is ridiculous. There's no distinction between an object has sensible qualities and then I have a sensation in my mind. There's no gap between the two. What I'm when I say that a chair has brownness, I'm saying it has a feature of experience, a feature that can only exist in a mind. And so if the whole object is made up of those types of things, the whole object must therefore be in the mind. That's what Berkeley's getting at. I want to make that clear before we move much further. Is there any questions? All right, well, we're going to get into the reading. It's going to be really interesting tonight. And then we'll continue. All right, welcome back. We just finished the reading in the dialogues, going over some different objections that Hylas brings up. It appears that Hylas has sort of reverted, in a sense, on some of his arguments, or he has decided to question from a different angle a lot of the things that he has previously accepted. And because up to this point, he's pretty much admitted that all qualities that we would attribute to an object, primary and secondary, exist in the mind. So now he's going to come at the whole situation very differently, and now Philonous has to respond to these objections. What is the first argument from the reading that you identify? What's the first thing that Hylas is going to attack?
We have it on the board, active versus passive.
Yeah. Well, what do I mean by that? Do you know which argument that's referring to?
He's saying, he brings up the tulip first, and he's saying that there's a difference between perceiving the tulip and he's saying there's a difference between the perception of the tulip and the tulip itself.
Mm-hmm.
So as I perceive the tulip, I'm perceiving the colors, but then there's something that the tulip, the way I'm not doing, the tulip is.
Right.
The tulip exists anyway.
So what he's getting at is that the sensation exists in my mind. He's admitted that much, but what he's trying to get at is that, okay, there's a difference between the action of me perceiving and then what's in the object. So, and this is sort of going back to during the review, what I was talking about with some of the discussions that have been made up online about, are we like actively discovering what's in the object, and then that comes into my mind as I'm like perceiving it. And that's sort of what Hylas is saying. Hylas is saying that yes, red is on the tulip, all right, but it comes into my mind when I, by my own action, sense it. Like that's sort of like if I were to say sensing, I am sensing the object. Mm-hmm. The object's out there, has redness on it. I am sensing it. Therefore, those qualities at that moment in time enter my mind when I'm by an action sensing it. But this is the point that Philonous does in response is there is sensations, my receiving sensations. In fact, that's actually a good way of describing it. Am I actively sensing or am I receiving sensations? Is it active that I'm going out and sensing something, or is the sensations coming into my mind against my power or will? Mm-hmm. And what's the parallel that he draws here? What examples does he give of things that are active?
Let's see here. Well, he talks about smelling a flower.
Yes.
And taking a flower and putting it up against your nose.
He's not smelling.
And he distinguishes that the act of just holding the flower up to your nose between, to be different from smelling.
Yes, from the actual receiving of the scent. So I can pick up the flower, I can suck in air, I can do these different acts by my will, but that's not the same thing as smelling. Yeah. And once that air, once that comes up into my nose, I can't decide by my will what that smell is. And that's, I think the better example is even with vision. Okay? Yeah. I can choose to close my eyes or open them. I cannot determine actively what it is my eyes perceive as far as the light and the colors and the things of that sort. Nothing that I can do actively can affect that. So what the point is that am I actively going out and discovering sensations or determining them into my mind, or am I passively receiving information from, and of course Berkeley I think is ultimately going to be from God. Mm-hmm. But where am I passive in this process, or am I active in sensation? And when it comes to sensations, when it comes to the sense experiences that we were talking about earlier, when I was trying to clarify this, when it comes to sense experiences, am I active or am I passive? And Berkeley's point is that we're passive. And he goes with the different examples that he showed Hylas. Hylas would concede and say, yes, you are correct. I cannot determine by an act of will what any particular color is. I can determine from an act of will whether I open or close my eyes, but not what my eyes actually take in. So it's not an active process at all. I can't help it. I don't have control over it. So I'm not going out and sensing. I am receiving. And so that's the first argument. What's the second one that we go through?
The substratum or the substance argument.
Does anybody know what? And there's some questions during the reading, and I'm going to get to them here promptly. But first, can anybody give me the gist of Hylas' argument? Does anybody realize what his argument is? What's he trying to get at?
That there's something under the qualities. Like that there's a matter supporting the qualities or the perceived.
You're right, and that thing is mind independent.
Yeah, a mind independent matter that is supporting the perception.
Yes, an underlying substance. Now, the reason that this is being brought up is because in trying to, and this is actually, I think, a commonly held notion even now, and this actually isn't too far different from the previous, about the active versus passive. There's an object out there and I'm actively sensing it. Okay, so he says, oh, okay, fine. All right, I'm not actively sensing an object. I'm passive in this process. But what is sending those sensations to my mind, including extension, is this underlying substance. There's an underlying thing out there, something out there. A substance, a substratum, whatever you want to call it. There's something out there that is a material thing, and it's causing extension, primary qualities, as well as the secondary qualities of color, smell, etc. into my mind. So, what is this substratum? Now, this is where Philonous really attacks Hylas on several different points. But does anybody realize what some of his arguments are? Why is he getting at the whole, okay, well, is it extended? Why would he attack Hylas that way? Why is he attacking him saying, why is the substratum extended? Is the substratum solid?
Because he wants to show that the substratum or substance that Hylas believes to be out there, that you can't perceive.
It's unknowable.
Yeah.
It's unknowable. It's an unknowable a priori argument. He's saying that I believe that the substratum exists that in order to try to explain these things that do exist in my mind, but the way in which the only way he can ever describe anything that he claims to exist is using things he's already conceded to exist in the mind. So you can't even talk about a substance, underlying substance, or a substratum without using terms that you claim to be in the mind. But yet you're claiming this is mind independent.
Yeah.
Okay, so that's why he says, well, is this substance extended? Does it have extension? I mean, the way you describe it, it's spread out underneath all these different qualities. But doesn't the idea of it being spread out necessitate the idea of it being extended? But then we already can see that to be in the mind, all extension. So what is this? Essentially, Philonous is saying that it's totally unknowable. Why are you even asserting it? It's what we would call an ad hoc argument. It's an argument that is using unnecessary explanations in order to justify a theory. He wants to maintain that these sensations come from something that's mind independent. That there's something, or that there's something mind independent at all. So he decides to invoke terminology here, the terminology of the philosophers, as Berkeley would probably criticize, in order to try to explain this whole thing. And Berkeley's just saying this is an unknowable thing. This is nothing. It's a meaningless phrase. And so we continue. Now this is another interesting argument that gets a funny response from Philonous. Hylas says, okay, well, if we take each sensation by itself, of course it's in the mind. But now if we put them all together, that's a different situation. What was Philonous' response to this?
He says, either Hylas, you are jesting or have a very bad memory.
Yeah, absolutely. And the reason Philonous was so harsh on Hylas on this point is because you see that each individual sensation, even in his arguments, he relates sensations together. Especially like when you look at motion and solidity, he says, well, they're all subsumed under extension. So there is a relationship. They're not taken just by themselves. Yeah. The relationship between how a thing really sounds and waves in the air. There's a relationship, a correlative relationship. So he's not saying that they're completely isolated from one another. He is talking about them in relation to others. But he's saying that if you take the sum whole of all sensations, or all sensible experiences, extension and the primary qualities down to the taste of sourness, you would take all of those, and if they're all demonstrated to be in the mind, you can't combine them and then make a mind-independent object.
Yeah.
If the whole, in all its parts, is mind-dependent, you can't put it together and change its nature. You can't. If you were to find a bunch of severed limbs, okay, and then you identify each part as being a human part, okay, that's a human arm, that's a human leg, that's a human head. You're not going to put all those parts back together again and say you have a dog. But that's essentially what Hylas is concluding. He's saying that even though we've concluded all the parts in their totality to be of a certain ontological nature, when we combine them, we're going to get something else. And of course, it's absurd. And that's the whole point that he's getting at there. But now we're going to get to a very important argument. It's one that Philonous is willing to rest everything on. And it's been labeled the master argument, Berkeley's master argument. Can anybody find me where that's at? It should be on page 84.
Yep. He says, to pass by all that has been said so far, and reckon it for nothing, if you will have it so, I am content to put the whole upon this issue. If you can conceive it possible for any mixture or combination of qualities, or any sensible object whatever, to exist without the mind, then I will grant it actually to be so.
That's the master argument. But now, how does it unfold?
Hylas says that he can conceive a tree or a house existing by itself, independent of and unperceived by any mind whatsoever.
How is this refuted?
Can you see a thing which is at the same time unseen?
No, that's a contradiction. But then how's he turn this on Hylas?
Is it not a great?
Hylas is saying, Hylas says, you're perceiving the tree.
Right. Even in your mind, even if you're conceiving it in your imagination, you can't even conceive in your imagination an unconceived thing. If you're conceiving it, you're conceiving it. It's a contradiction to say, I'm conceiving of something unconceived. No, you're conceiving it. That's the master argument. He's saying that, and the reason he says I'm willing to rest the whole on this is because this argument is meant to entail his entire system in one fatal shot. He's saying, and then he'll say this to anybody. He goes, can you see anything unseen? No. Okay, well, it's in the mind. Okay, so can you conceive of anything unconceived? No. So all things exist in the mind then. That's what follows. Because there is no unconceived things that you can know of. Because this is a relationship. You can't say that something exists that you don't know of. You can only say that things exist that you know of. Like, for instance, I don't know if a pink unicorn exists. I have no knowledge of such, so I will not say a pink unicorn exists. Similarly, if there's an object you have no knowledge of whatsoever, you don't say that it exists. It wouldn't make any sense to. So that's what the whole point of the master argument is. It assumes that much. That's the assumed premise. And it goes from there and says, okay, Joe, have you ever seen an unseen thing? No. Have you ever conceived of an unconceived thing? No. So all things are conceived or seen? Yes. And if things that are seen are in the mind, and things that are conceived are in the mind, then all things are in the mind. That's the master argument. Now, that's Berkeley's attempt to sum up the whole thing. But now the master argument's interesting because there's been critiques of the master argument, some good ones. But before we get to those, I want some questions from you guys. Got any questions for me on any of this, but in particular the master argument?
If I can conceive of a unicorn, does that mean that it's real?
Oh, okay.
Because even you can talk about comic books and people conceiving of these characters that have different powers. How does the master argument deal with that?
Well, like there's between, you mean dream and reality? Is sort of like what you're saying, or between
yeah.
Well, it depends what you mean by real in that sense. Now, and this is an important distinction to make. Like, there's real as in it exists within the continuity of our experience, and then there's real as in a sense, if you're saying that unicorn as a character, as a drawing, as a piece of art, or as something in a comic book, does it exist in that sense? Yes, and that's the only way you can conceive of it anyway. You can't conceive of it in the sense that I passively have it revealed to my mind. I see it out there walking around in the woods.
Yeah.
You don't understand it in that way. You conceive it as an act of will by combining sensations in your own mind and your own imagination by your own power. So I think that's where the passive-active distinction comes in again. For instance,
So it doesn't make it real, is what you're saying.
It doesn't make it-
Because I conceive something doesn't make it real.
well, it depends on how you use the word real. It's not real in the sense that I'm passive and it's presenting itself to me regardless of my will. Okay? Now, that might be the case with like a picture of a unicorn. You might not be able to help if you walk in the room and you see a picture of a unicorn. The picture's real, correct?
Yeah.
Okay? Now, is your imagination real? Okay? In the sense that, well, you're seeing something. That part can't be denied. But are you passive in the process? When you imagine something, are you being passive?
No.
No. Okay, you're active.
Uh-huh.
Now be the distinction. Okay? There's things that are passively revealed to you in the continuity of your experience, and then there's something that's you're actively in control of. Okay, which would be like in your imagination.
Okay.
And that's actually probably how we would define imaginary things in general. It's something developed by my mind by an active will. All right, and I think that's what Berkeley's argument would be. But there's other things too. There's others, like for instance, dreams and stuff. Sometimes you can't help what you dream about.
Yeah.
Okay.
Hallucinations.
Hallucinations,
Uh-huh.
reoccurring memories. Now, and I think you would have to delve deeper into Edwards and Berkeley, understand their explanation for these. But simply speaking, you have, a continuity of experience. Okay, you go to work, you eat supper, you lay down for bed. All of a sudden, you're flying through outer space. Okay, and there's giant unicorn creatures and lizard kings and all kinds of stuff. Okay, then you wake up and you go back through the same line.
Yeah.
Okay, there's a disruption in your experience. Okay, your perceptual experience.
Yeah.
Now you were still perceiving things.
Uh-huh.
Okay, but they were not with the ebb and flow of your normal pattern.
Yeah.
That's how we know dreams are different from reality. That's the only way we know.
Okay.
All right, because if we were, in a matrix scenario where we went to sleep and then we never wake up and we just lived in that dream forever, would we know what was real? Was the time that I can remember walking to work, going to school, going to bed the night, was that real? Or is the dream that I'm living in now forever, is that the more real? Was this a dream or was this a dream? Now, the reason we distinguish and we can know, well, actually I would say there's two things. One, typically dreams don't have the same sensible clearness.
Yeah, that's true.
So for instance, if I eat something in my dreams, it's not as vivid in my memory in a dream as it is when I'm actually eating it out here.
Uh-huh.
Okay, so there's a lack of clarity. And likewise in dreams disrupt the flow as I remember it, and then I go back to that same flow once I wake up. That really, those are the only ways any person knows the difference between the dream and reality.
Would you say that the flow is foundational reality, and then like dreams or your imagination kind of builds on that?
Well, yeah, absolutely.
You
can't if you were never sensing color before, you can't have a dream with colors in it.
Yeah.
Because dreams and imagination, they usually borrow things. Most of the time when we have dreams, they're like not always crazy radical flying through space. A lot of times they are, you're being chased by zombies, but you're still in your hometown, or you're still running through your house or your old school. That cliche dream that you're naked at your graduation. There's common experiences that you had out here that you use in the formulation of your dreams. Now, and I think Berkeley, being the Christian theist that he was, would interpret things like dreams, not just being physical anomalies. Dreams are revealed to the mind from God for a particular purpose.
Well, okay, now this might be opening a can of worms a little bit, but how does God relate to all, how is our perception of God relate to a master argument?
You're not opening a can of worms. You're getting to the objections that are really important to get
to.
to.
Okay.
Really good to get to, because that's an important criticism of the master argument. That was brought up in David Hume, and it's good to address it because the master argument is flawed at this point. And the reason it's flawed at this point is not so much because the master argument cannot be used or modified, but because Berkeley says I'm willing to rest my whole on this point, and he doesn't qualify it.
Yeah.
And so it's not because the master argument is flawed, it's because Berkeley was being arrogant and didn't add enough to the master argument to protect himself from objection. It's more of a misstep on Berkeley's part than on the argument.
Okay.
But the master argument is saying, can I conceive of the unconceived? Can I see the unseen? Was not God unseen?
Yeah.
So you're saying he's unreal. That would be Hume's criticism. Hume said, and this is the same thing in George's Dicker, Berkeley's Idealism: A Critical Examination, a book that I'm critical of because I think it's very sloppy scholarship. But this is one of the good points that's made in there, is that Berkeley, being the devout theist that he was, would have been very upset to see that the master argument could be turned against him on that very point. But now the master argument doesn't just turn against God, though. It turns against consciousness itself, as fundamental as it is. Because, do you see your own consciousness?
Yeah.
Can you conceive of your own consciousness? Well, maybe in some sense, but not quite.
Yeah.
The idea here is perception, though, in a perceptual way, in a sensible way. No, you can't. But now this is actually another argument to vindicate that this isn't a problem with the argument. This is actually a problem with this Berkeley's arrogance on this, because the master argument, if you were to use it in that way, though, makes all positions self-refuting, because you can't deny consciousness. It's fundamental. And so I think Berkeley would probably assume Berkeley would say, whoa, calm down. He would probably, if he were to look at the objections being made, he would say, first of all, consciousness is the base. You can't have sensations without consciousness. You can't have conceiving of anything, unless you first assume that there's conscious beings doing this. And then he would probably tack on to here an important argument that he'll make later on, we'll discuss. It is, can something give what itself does not have? Which I'm not going to reveal too much later, to one of his theistic arguments. But what this means, if he attaches this onto here, he saves the whole argument. It can still be used, as long as he has the qualifiers that these sensations can't come into my mind by my own mind, and I have to assume I have a mind. If those two are just left in there, the master argument's fine. But the fact he left that out, he can be opened up to an objection. And I think the reason it's an objection is only because Berkeley was being cocky and just didn't make the argument expanded enough.
Maybe he felt that he already dealt with that.
Yeah, and I would say so. I think that's correct. I think he felt that didn't really need to be discussed.
Yeah.
So he might think that the people objecting in this way would be kind of silly. Maybe even trite. And I think that's the reason people jump all over it, is because Berkeley isn't alive to respond. And I'm sure his response will be something like that. He goes, well, that's ridiculous, absurd. But once again, though, that is one of the fatal flaws in it, only because Berkeley isn't around to respond to it. And yes, it's valid to say that if the master argument is saying that, can we see the unseen? No. Can we conceive the unconceivable? No. Well, therefore, what about God and what about our own consciousness? And that eventually becomes Hume's position. Hume questions not only the existence of God, but also even the validity of our own consciousness. So he ends up referring to it as just a collection of experiences, and he doesn't really explain that very well. So this is really important. Now, is there any more questions?
I don't have any more questions.
You already answered my substratum one, so.
Okay. Well, thanks for coming. This was a quick study, good study, and we might be finishing up the first dialogue next study. So it looks to be that way. So have a good night, and see you next time.